Hi, it's Steve Palladino from Palladino Power Project, and I'm bringing you another video. This time I'm branching out. I'm going to talk a little bit about training load metrics, and I'll tie in some of the Stryd training load metrics that are present now. But this is a little bit different than my usual videos that generally are tutorials on using the Superpower calculator. I use WKO and specifically WKO4. There is a WKO5 now, and you can get some of these advanced metrics that I'll do in a second or third part of this particular presentation. In this presentation, part one, I just want to go over the basic training load metrics that have been around for quite a while. So let's start with a look at this guy here, which is the performance manager chart, which I've modified a little bit. I'll go into those modifications in just a second. But first, I want to say that this performance manager chart was developed by Dr. Andrew Coggin, and presented in about 2008. Before that, though, Dr. Coggin developed the concept of training stress score, TSS. And prior to that, going all the way back to 1975, Bannister et al. Presented for the first time in the literature their impulse response model. And basically what happened is that model presented by Bannister formed the basis for Dr. Coggin's work on both training stress score and then elaborating that into a full performance manager chart. In the summary, the notes on this particular video, I'll link Dr. Coggin's 2008 article, and I will also link an article that I wrote on training load metrics in running back in 2017. All right, with that little history, I'm going to also add that Stryd introduced their own version of a stress score, so to speak, with running stress score in 2017. It's calculated different than training stress score, but it is the same general principle, and I'm going to go to that in just a second. But before that, on the Stryd metrics, Stryd now in 2020 introduced the new Power Center. And in the new Power Center, they have a chart called My Training, which gives you your daily running stress score and what they refer to as a 6-week average, which is not quite correct, and I'll elaborate on that. So they actually now brought this performance manager chart to a degree into Power Center, which is a major advantage, providing that to the many runners that are using Power Center. They also have a chart that tracks your running stress balance, which I'm going to describe in a moment as well. So again, there's this flow, Bannister to Coggin, and that's been around. Like I said, 2003 was when TSS was first introduced. 2008 was when the performance manager chart was introduced, and fast forward about 12 years more, and now we're getting these metrics introduced into Power Center, which is great. Okay, let's go a little bit into the underlying metric here. In WKO, it is training stress score. In Power Center, it is running stress score. That is the little cell, the little element that is a reflection of both volume in terms of duration and intensity in terms of relative to functional threshold power or relative to critical power. So just a sidetrack, runners are very familiar with tracking training load in the form of volume, and that is miles or kilometers. And some will track in terms of hours and minutes and seconds. What this metric does, when I say this, training stress score and running stress score in slightly different calculations, and that's not important right now, but what is important is they track the interaction of both duration and relative intensity. So they combine them together in that stress score, whether it's training stress score or running stress score. For example, a 7-mile run at a very easy effort of about 80% of functional threshold power, 80% of critical power, is a whole different animal than a 7-mile run, which includes a 1-mile warm-up and then 5 miles of tempo at 97% of functional threshold power, critical power, and then a 1-mile cool down. Two different animals. One, the latter is going to be a much higher training load or training stress or training stimulus. So this TSS and RSS allows one to encapsulate both duration and relative intensity into one number, one score for that particular run that you did. Now, when you take that unit, that score for that individual run, and you fold it into this model, the performance manager model that Dr. Coggin elaborated, then let's talk about how that works, how that unit becomes the functional unit that goes into these additional calculations. So in this chart here, I want to point out the blue line, the thicker blue line here. That is the chronic training load. Then there is the magenta or pink line, thinner line here. That is the acute training load. And the yellow bars, which are the training stress balance. Okay, so chronic training load is an exponentially weighted average of all those TSS scores, an exponentially weighted average that has a 42-day, a 6-week time constant attached to that particular calculation. So that a chronic training load really, because of the exponential and the decay process, really is a reflection of what the training has been for the last 3 months, about double what the time constant is. So a 6-week time constant means about 3 months of data. Now, that said, The training stress score that is more recent is going to be weighted higher than that one from 3 months ago, which is about ready to drop out. So that is a exponentially weighted training load with a 6-week time constant, which gives you about 3 months worth of data included in that analysis. Acute training load is a 2-week exponential, an exponentially weighted moving average for all the TSS with a time constant of 7 days. So that means about 2 weeks of data. Again, with the more recent weighted heavier and the older, the 2-week-old data, next to nothing. So basically what we have is we can reflect the longer term training, which is really what your body has adapted to, the chronic stimulus, the chronic training load, versus the shorter term training load, the acute training load, which is what you are, it's the more recent stimulus. It's the stimulus that your body is going to adapt to. So it's the more recent will create a little bit more fatigue, assuming that it is higher than the chronic. I'm going to go into that in just a second. So you have a chronic training load, which is your longer term, and you have an acute training load, which is your shorter term. Each of these are composed with these daily run units of TSS score or running stress score. You then could come up with another metric where if you subtract the chronic training load from the acute training load, I take that back. If you subtract the acute training load from the chronic training load, you get a metric called training stress balance. Again, acute training load, ATL minus CTL, is your training stress balance, or your running stress balance. Now, in Power Center, it gives you in the My Training chart, it will give you that exponentially weighted 6-week, 42-day time constant training load. It'll show you that line. It's not going to show you the acute training load. It just doesn't want to cloud up the picture, but it shows you the chronic training load. It will also show you the running stress balance, which is basically they're running acute training load in the background, and they're still doing the math. Their ATL minus CTL equals running stress balance, and that's that number that you get. Basically, let me show you and show you in pictorial form. When your chronic training load is higher than your acute training load. So let me rephrase that. If your acute training load is smaller than your chronic training load, if you subtract CTL from ATL, ATL minus CTL, that's going to give you a positive number in general, and that is reflected here. The line, horizontal line, is 0 training stress balance, or 0 RSB if you were using that. So if your short-term training load is less than what you've been doing on your chronic training load, you're going to have a positive stress balance. In contrast, if you have a short-term training load which is higher than your chronic training load, short-term is higher than long-term. So if you run that math, in fact, I'll give you the numbers. This one here, acute training load 172, chronic training load 142. All right, and that gives you a minus 26 if you do the math. 172 minus 142 should be about minus 20. Actually, in this, your training stress balance and running stress balance is for today is what the math was yesterday. So it's reflecting your relative state today from what happened yesterday. So again, acute training load higher than chronic training load means that you're going to have a negative training stress balance. The more your short-term training is generating higher TSS or RSS than your chronic, then the more negative you'll be. So let me do another little tangent here. In some places, some platforms, CTL is named fitness, and ATL is called fatigue, and TSB is called form. Well, these are people trying to assign names that suggest a certain way of understanding these things, but realize it doesn't really work. Really, what these are training load metrics based on TSS units. Now, yes, as you gain CTL, you're probably gaining fitness, but it is not the only thing that determines your race readiness per se. There's other things. What is the composition of that training load? You can build your chronic training load just doing easy aerobic runs and never do anything higher intensity. And while you'll have a higher training or CTL chronic training load, you may not necessarily be race ready for a 5K or 10K because you haven't done any intensity work. So is this fitness? Yes, loosely it's fitness, but it isn't absolutely the only thing that determines your fitness. So be careful in assigning some qualitative name for some of these metrics. They don't necessarily mean exactly what you think they might mean if you follow strictly by what the qualitative name is. Same thing with fatigue. Now, it's I like to think of ATL not as fatigue, but potentially as fatigue generating. It's more considered recent stimulus, recent training stress. So it's the things that are happening more recently that's driving what you're wanting to happen with your fitness. And then form is reasonable in that the more negative your TSB or RSB, the less performance ready you are, the lower your form is, if you want to apply that, and the higher your TSB or RSB, the more positive is, the greater your the more performance ready you are. Now, this is within limits, of course. I mean, if you get too positive with your training stress balance, you're not ready to perform. You're going to be already losing fitness. You're going to be giving up so much chronic training load that you're not ready to perform. So there is limits to this form terminology that's commonly utilized. That's the first part, just understanding what these metrics are. Again, the chronic training load is about 3 months, but it's weighted, exponentially weighted with a 6-week time constant. So the more recent is more heavily weighted, but it contains about 3 months worth of data in determining that particular number. When I say contains data, TSS units, what each run is when you load it into this model. Acute training load is the more recent. Again, a exponentially weighted with a rolling average with a 7-day time constant. So about 2 weeks of total training data, or TSS, contained with weighting heavier, more recent, and smaller towards the 2-week point. And then there is training stress balance, or running stress balance, which is just the mathematical difference between ATL and CTL, acute training load and chronic training load. So there you have it. That's a brief introduction. That's part one. I'm going to come back with a little bit more in other parts. Thank you.